this DVD, I will focus on counterattacks, the clinch, and defending against your opponent's takedowns. In addition to learning the basic techniques, it is also very important that you focus on timing. As you will soon see, timing is very, very important. If your timing is off, utilizing one of the countering measures I lay out could be hazardous. Instead of evading your opponent's attack and landing one of your own, you suffer the hit. Along these same lines, it is very important to develop a keen sense of distance. If you attempt to throw a kick and there is not adequate distance between you and your opponent, again, you will suffer rather than your opponent. If you want to keep a fight standing, it is very important to spend some time on the takedown defense portion of this DVD. It is also important for those of you who would rather take the fight to the ground because the techniques will often allow you to attain the top position, which in most cases is more advantageous to you. The clinch is just as important because it is often a difficult position to avoid. If your opponent is determined to tie you up, you must know how to gain the upper hand. By establishing the holds I've laid out, you create openings to land hard strikes or even take your opponent down. However, if your opponent manages to get a more dominant hold, you've also got to know how to escape. If you fail to learn these defensive techniques, you're basically putty in your opponent's hands. He can take you down, land strikes, all sorts of nasty stuff. If you take the time to master all the techniques I've laid out, in addition to the striking and grappling techniques I've laid out on the other DVDs, you will have a well-rounded game.
Solta. Em vez de peidar aqui. Não levanta muito não. Vamos no braço. Vai. Vai pra frente. Vai. Olha logo a minha perna deitada no chão.
I would like to talk for a moment about timing and sense of distance in my fighting style, both of which are very important. For example, when an opponent attacks, I will often use what we call a counter strike. My opponent throws a punch or kick, but I time his movements and hit him with the strike before he can connect with his strike. So I base my strike off my opponent's movements. Another counter is what we call nikiri in karate. With this counter, you defend with your footwork rather than a block. For example, if my opponent throws a strike and I stand right in front of him, I will take a hit. With nikiri, my opponent attacks and I exit to avoid his strike. Having missed his punch, my opponent is left off balance and I am in a good position to fire back with a strike of my own. Just as with countering, nikiri takes exceptional timing. Sense of distance is also very important. I will only move back enough to avoid my opponent's strike, nothing more. If I misread his movement and don't move back far enough, I will get hit. If I misread his movement and move back too far, I will not be in a good position to follow up with a strike of my own. However, it is much easier to read your opponent's movements when you fight at a distance. If you fight up close, you will not see the strike coming until it is too late. This is why I always fight at a distance. When you close that distance, it is very important to do so with strikes. When your opponent attempts to close the distance, you move out of range of his strike and then launch a counter strike. Now, if your opponent manages to close the distance and you don't have the time to get out of the way, then you will execute a block. However, blocking should be a secondary strategy. You always want to utilize footwork first. I always say the best defense is footwork. If you have the strategy of using your arms to block your opponent's attacks, you will be at a much higher risk of getting knocked out or hit. The only time you want to block is when you can't escape using footwork. For example, my opponent throws a cross and I can't use footwork to escape, so I block his strike. He then throws another punch and I block that one. However, if I continue to stand here and block, eventually he will hit me, so I move away from him as quickly as possible using footwork. The greatest defense comes from distance. For example, if my opponent wants to throw a punch, he must enter into my range. However, when he enters in and throws a punch, I extend my range. If he throws another punch and enters, I again extend my distance. If he comes in yet again, then I exit off to the side. I am always using side-to-side movement in combination with nikiri. When I feel cornered, as a last resort, I will use a block. Now I am going to show you how to use timing in a fight, which is very, very important. We will start with countering a round kick using a cross. In order to apply this strike, you need to train it many, many times. You should train it so much that you do not have to see the kick coming. You feel it coming. You can tell by your opponent's initial movements exactly what he's going to do. When my opponent begins his strike, I enter and counter before he can throw it. Once he begins to move, I move with him. With speed, it looks a little like this. My opponent begins to throw his strike, and I quickly close the distance and strike one of his vital points. Once more slowly. Though he took the initiative with his strike, I am beating him to the punch with my counter strike. Now I demonstrate how to counter an opponent's round kick with a right cross, and then follow up with the sweep. When I strike my opponent, he will get forced backwards. Before he can re-establish his base, I follow up by sweeping his grounded leg out from underneath him.
Aí eu vou mostrar o golpe. Mais uma vez, devagar.
Once more slowly. The technique I show now has the same timing as a counter strike. It is a very common technique in karate, but not as common in other styles. When my opponent throws a round kick, I will switch my stance and enter in with my opposite leg and hand. It is important that the strike is very explosive. It is also very important that you elevate your opposite arm to block. The goal is to land your strike before your opponent can land his kick, thereby reducing all power behind his kick.
Mantendo a distância, rápido.
But in case your timing is off, it is very important to put up your block. This is another technique for evading and countering an opponent's round kick. Reading his movements, I see that he's about to throw a round kick. As a result, I step my lead leg back to evade his strike. It is very important to keep your hips square until you rotate for your kick. If you move your center of gravity as you step back, not only will it take longer to evade your opponent's strike, but you will also lose power in your kick. It is important to move with your opponent. As he enters with his kick, you step back and then throw your kick. Once more slowly. As he kicks, I retract my front leg and throw my kick. Now I demonstrate how to counter an opponent's round kick using a spinning back kick. It is a complex technique. You have to turn and kick to your opponent's stomach before he can land his kick. So your opponent kicks and you turn and kick with him. When you spin, it adds power to your kick. A little faster now to show the movement. Once more, my opponent kicks, and I turn and throw a back kick. Now I will spar with my brother, countering his round kicks using the techniques I just demonstrated. In this technique, I step my lead foot to the outside of my opponent's body, leading him to believe that I will throw a round kick. Normally, my opponent will attempt to counter my movement by throwing a jab. However, immediately after stepping my lead foot to the outside of his body, I move to the opposite side of his body. Not only does my footwork cause my opponent to miss with his jab, but it also puts me in a perfect position to counter with a cross. A little faster.